This is lecture 55F in the series ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, Volume 3, Communism in East Asia. And today we're taking the last half. In the last lecture we went through the first half of the Imperial feudal period in China. Now we're taking the second half of it, which will end in 1911. So we have quite a bit of territory to cover. And this is called Imperial China Evolves and Meets Capitalist Imperialism. Now, in the late Tang period, there were ineffective and corrupt rulers and officials in the imperial court, and this allowed regional warlords to trigger widespread revolts. The most catastrophic of these was the Wang Chao Rebellion from AD 874 to AD 884. Now, it affected the entire empire for a decade. Mr. Wang was a rich salt trader, instrumental in Wang Zhangzi's rebellion in AD 875. Wang split with Wang, W-A-N-G, the first Wang is H-U-A-N-G, his army pillaging widely, committing the Guangzhou massacre. In AD 879, the southern port Guangzhou was sacked and most of its inhabitants were murdered. That massacre focused on the large foreign merchant enclaves. The landed nobility was striking back against the bourgeoisie. In AD 881, Wang's troops marched on China's capital at Chang'an, and the emperor fled one step ahead. Wang, H-U-A-N-G, proclaimed himself Qi Emperor, Q-I, reigning for 3.5 years. In AD 883, he was defeated by the new Tang army, led by Xiaotuo chieftain Li Qiyang. Consequently, he was now forced to desert Chang'an. On the run, Wang's army was defeated several times before his generals threw in the towel, and in AD 84, his nephew Lin Yan killed Wang. Now, meanwhile, in AD 881, both capitals, Yueyang and Chang'an, had fallen. Fighting back, Tang had to rely on ethnic Han and Turkic warlords to suppress the rebellion. The fall of the Tang dynasty came at the hands of Zhu Wei, that's Z-H-U-W-E-N, Zhu Wen. Zhu Wen was a Jiedushi, or military governor, who had been a general under the rival emperor Wang Chao's empire of Qi. Now Zhu was able to conquer most of central China, although Shanxi and Hebei remained controlled by rival new regimes in Qi, Jin, and Yan, respectively. Most of his campaigns were directed at the Xiaotuo-ruled Jin regime to become the later Tang, based in Shanxi. Now, resourceful Jin leaders, first under Li Qiyang and then later under his son Lu Kunshu, defeated the Tang regime. Emperor Taizu focused on unifying the north. He was not able to make any inroads into the south, and over the next few decades during the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a dozen kingdoms arose. These rulers in the south were nominally submissive to Taizu's federal regime, with the exception of Wu and Shu. In AD 907, Zhu overthrew the empire of Tang and established the later Liang, with Shu as its emperor. This ushered in the era of the 5 dynasties and the 10 kingdoms. Emperor Taizu's reign lasted until AD 912, when he was killed by his son Shu Yugi. Shu Yugi was subsequently overthrown by his brother, Zhu Yuzhen, the next year. The later Liang would last until AD 923. 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. From AD 907 to 960, China witnessed 5 successive regimes, namely the Liang, Tang, Jin, Han, and Zhou. They rapidly succeeded one another in control of the traditional imperial heartland in northern China. Among the regimes were Sinofied Xiaotuo Turks that ruled over the Tang, Jin, and the ethnic majority of Han Chinese. More stable and smaller regimes of mostly ethnic Han rulers coexisted in the south and western China over the period cumulatively constituting the 10 kingdoms. Now, amidst this political chaos, the strategic 16 prefectures located along today's Great Wall were ceded to the emerging Khitan Liao dynasty. This drastically weakened the defense of China proper against the northern nomadic empires. To the south, Vietnam gained lasting independence, after having been a Chinese prefecture for many centuries. The Northern War caused a southward migration of population, and accordingly there was a southward shift of cultural and economic activity. The chaos ended with the coup of Zhou general Zhao Kongyin and the establishment of the Song dynasty in AD 960. His Song regime eventually annihilated the remains of the 10 kingdoms, reunifying China. Song, Liao, Jin, and the Western Xia dynasties from AD 960 to AD 1234. In AD 960, the Song dynasty was founded by Emperor Taizu. His capital was established in Kaifeng. By AD 979, the Song dynasty had reunified most of nuclear China, although the outer territories were occupied by Sinicized nomadic empires. The Khitan Liao dynasty, which lasted from 907 to 1125, ruled over Manchuria, Mongolia, and parts of northern China. Meanwhile, in what are now the northwestern Chinese provinces of Gansu, Shaanxi, and Ningxia, the Tanggu tribes founded the Western Xia dynasty from 1032 to 1227. In AD 1004, the Liao cavalry, fully equipped with cataphracts, swept over the exposed North China plain and reached the outskirts of Taizu's capital at Kaifeng. Cataphracts were heavily armored horsemen, with both the rider and steed draped from head to toe in steel armor, while wielding a lance. This was 500 years before Europeans built blast furnaces that could make steel out of iron at a reasonable cost. The cataphract was the tactical weapon that broke the Chinese lines. Afterwards, the Chan Yuan Treaty imposed heavy annual tributes from the Song treasury. In reality, this was just a reciprocal movement of cash, as the Liao regime used it to purchase Chinese goods and products. It was a new bourgeois solution to military crises. Thus, far from being undone, the Song economy prospered while the government's treasury was being replenished. Meanwhile, this cross-border trade and contact induced further Sinicization within the Liao Empire. Like previous and subsequent nomadic conquerors, the Liao rulers would be culturally absorbed. Within the Liao Empire, the Jurchen masses revolted against their overlords when they realized that their victory had been Pyrrhic at best. In AD 1115, they established the Jin dynasty in the Liao Empire. In AD 1125, the Jin cataphract turned on its masters. It annihilated the Liao bosses, sending the remnants of the Liao court to Central Asia to found what they called the Western Liao Empire. In AD 1127, Jin invaded Song territory and Kaifeng was sacked. This Jingkang incident ended the northern Song dynasty. Later, the entire north of China was conquered. The surviving members of Song court regrouped in the new capital city of Hangzhou. There they kicked off the southern Song dynasty, which ruled south of the Hui, Huai, river. In the ensuing years, China was divided between the Song dynasty, the Jin dynasty, and the Western Xia dynasty. This tripart era did not end until the Mongol conquest. Now, in the land of Song, the ascending general crisis of capitalism meets the descending general crisis of slavery. The population of China soared to over 100 million. The living standards of common people improved tremendously in their new lands, where advanced rice cultivation arose alongside iron farm tool production. The capital cities of Kaifeng and subsequently Hangzhou were the most populous cities in the world. A native Chinese bourgeoisie dominated the cities. The Chinese bourgeoisie itself ranged from the small to the big. Domestic trade was conducted by standardized Song coinage as the de facto currency of exchange. With prosperous economic activities, the historically first use of paper currency emerged in the western city of Chengdu as a supplement to the existing copper coins. International trade was successful as the merchant marine sidestepped the nomadic empires altogether. All too often, these troublesome foreigners had blocked land trading routes to the far west. Now giant wooden vessels equipped with compasses traveled the East and South China Seas and the northern Indian Ocean. In AD 1132, a federal standing navy was created to physically protect merchant mariners. In the cities, the merchant banking class emerged to provide insurance for maritime merchants, encouraging them to take risks by hedging those risks via insurance. For the first time, long-distance maritime trade became financially sound. 200 years of inter-ruling class war. While business was booming, the rage and fear of the landed gentry, great and small, also grew rapidly. The success of the burghers and their bankers had put the landholding serfocrats' backs to the wall financially. This led to civil conflict that was only resolved when the emperor agreed to burn the traders' fleets and put up a permanent tariff and immigration wall against all foreigners. However, that was yet some time off. What we were witnessing in the Song Empire was a long, drawn-out period of feudalism. By definition, this is the period where you have both fundamental types of servitude relationships. Chattel slavery and wage slavery exist in one polity. In Western Europe and North America, the transition from the one to the other took only a few centuries. In China, it was taking 2,000 years. When the contradiction between the descending general crisis of slavery met the ascending general crisis of capitalism head-on, the entire empire shook apart. You'll recall that this had happened many times in China. The first empire had been created when the serfocrats went out over the slavocrats, which was just another way of saying that the burgeoning bourgeoisie, allied with progressive lords, won over the reactionary slavocrat lords. It was playing out on a much grander scale of a Oliver Cromwell type of civil war. Then in the period of imperial feudalism, it happened many times more. The ruling classes had come to their greatest hostile nexus in the An-Lushan Rebellion, which we discussed in the last lecture. Now, the Song dynasty saw great advances in science and technology, inventions such as the hydromechanical astronomical clock, the first continuous and endless power transmitting chain, wood block printing, paper money, and gunpowder had been invented. Gunpowder had actually been invented during the Tang dynasty, but was put to use on the battlefield by the Song army. From that invention came a succession of cannon and siege engines. By AD 1275, the Chinese had adopted the Neo-Confucian philosophy formulated by Zhu Xi. Enormous literary works were compiled during the Song dynasty, such as the historical work, which in English is called The Comprehensive Mirror to Aid in Government. The invention of movable type printing facilitated the spread of knowledge. In AD 1132, during the Southern Song dynasty, China's first standing navy was assembled with its admiralty at Dinghai. The Southern Song's survival required protecting the Yangtze and Huai rivers. These rivers were susceptible to attack by cavalry forces from the north. Against that threat were ground armies now supplemented by paddle wheel warships. These ships were equipped with trebuchets to launch incendiary bombs made of gunpowder and lime. In AD 1161, the Song Navy scored stunning victories over invading Jin forces at the Battle of Tangdao in the East China Sea and the Battle of Kaishi on the Yangtze River. Now the Mongols take China. The real threat to the Chinese Empire lay in the extensive preparation of the Mongol generals in the north. The prelude came a century later when Mongol troops took western Xia in AD 1227. Then they finished off the Jin dynasty in AD 1234, and finally they took the southern Song of China. But it was not an easy conquest. The Song government had halted the Mongols for more than 3 decades. However, the handwriting was on the wall as far as Mongol King Kublai Khan was concerned, and he declared a new government in China in AD 1271 with himself as emperor. The southern Song capital, Hangzhou, fell to him in AD 1276, and that was followed by the final annihilation of the Song navy at the Battle of Yemen in AD 1279. Awaiting the Mongols with somewhat bated breath were the Europeans, still miserably backward in every way. They would not even find the Western Hemisphere for more than 2 more centuries, and when they did, they didn't know where they were for decades thereafter. Now, the late imperial subperiod of Yuan China, is the Mongol century AD 1271 to 1368. At any rate, as we have seen, the Yuan dynasty was formally proclaimed in AD 1271. The great Khan of Mongolia, Kublai Khan, was one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan, and he assumed the title of Emperor of China, declaring a new Chinese dynasty. The Mongol Yuan dynasty became the first dynasty in Chinese history to rule all of China. From Beijing, Kublai Khan ruled not only China, but also the Mongolian heartland. And when I say Beijing, it was not exactly where that city is today, but it's pretty close. It was called Dadu, D-A-D-U. He ruled not only China, but Mongolia and the entire Mongol Empire. The Mongols then headed for Indochina and Japan, but were defeated in Vietnam and then Japan. Beijing is China's capital. The Grand Canal was reconstructed to connect the remote capital city to economic hubs in the southern part of China. This was the precedent for Beijing as the capital of all successive regimes in China. In AD 1304, a peace treaty ended the Mongol civil war among themselves. The emperors of the Yuan dynasty were recognized as the great Khans of the greater Mongol Empire. They were seen thereafter as the ultimate authorities over the Mongol Khanates. Pax Mongolica reigned over the Asian continent. For the first and only time in history, the Silk Road was controlled entirely by a single government. A network of secondary roads and a federal postal system connected the vast empire. In the oceans, a lucrative maritime trade flourished. Guangzhou and Hangzhou were the largest ports in the world. We're going to take a look at them in a moment when we go to our map. Adventurous travelers from the far west, most notably the Venetian Marco Polo, settled in China for decades. Upon Polo's return, his detailed travel record inspired generations of medieval Europeans with the splendors of the Far East. In Yuan China, paper currency called Chao, C-H-A-O, was the predominant medium of exchange. There was a learning process about the dangers of fiat currency. For example, what happens with unrestricted printing. Printing without gold or equivalent backing led to hyperinflation. That was a contributory factor in the downfall of the Yuan government. Traditional social structure and culture in China underwent immense transformation during the Mongol Yuan Empire. As we have seen, many foreign immigrants settled in China, and now they enjoyed an elevated social status over the majority of Han Chinese. Simultaneously, the class of scholar, officials, and intellectuals lost social status. Before the Mongol invasion, Chinese dynasties reported approximately 120 million inhabitants. After the conquest had been completed in AD 1279, the 1300 census reported half that, roughly 60 million people. One scholar, Frederick Mote, argues that the wide drop in numbers reflects an administrative failure to record, rather than an actual decrease. Timothy Brooke argues that the Mongol system of encirclement of a huge portion of the Chinese populace caused many to disappear from the census. William McNeill and David Morgan considered the plague as the main factor behind the demographic decline during this period. In the AD 1300s, China suffered from epidemics of plague that killed 25 million people, 30% of the entire population of China. In my own view, I think all of these scholars are probably correct, that they all have identified certain important factors in this reduction of population. In the AD 1340s, natural disasters and oppressive administration triggered widespread farmer uprisings. After the massive naval engagement at Lake Poyang, Xu Yanzhang prevailed over other rebel forces in the south. In AD 1368, Xu proclaimed himself the Hongwu Emperor, founding the Ming dynasty. That same year, his northern expedition army captured the capital, Khanbalik. The Yuan remnants fled back to Mongolia. Other Mongol Khanates in Central Asia continued to exist after the fall of the Yuan dynasty in China. Now, the Ming dynasty itself existed between AD 1368 and 1644. The capital was initially set at Nanjing and moved to Beijing from Ming Emperor Yongle onwards. Urbanization increased as the population grew, and as the division of labor grew more complex. Large urban centers such as Nanjing and Beijing also contributed to the growth of private industry. Small-scale industries grew, specializing in paper, silk, cotton, and porcelain goods. Relatively small urban centers with markets proliferated around the country. Town markets mainly traded food with some necessary manufactures such as pins or oil. Despite the xenophobia and intellectual introspection made popular by the new school of Neo-Confucianism, Ming China was not isolated. Foreign trade and other contacts with the outside world, particularly Japan, increased considerably. Chinese merchants explored all of the Indian Ocean, reaching East Africa with the voyages of Zheng He. We're going to take a look at the map here in just a moment of that. Inter-ruling class war continues. China in the AD 1400s. Anyway, the Hongwu Emperor was the only founder of Chinese dynasties with a peasant origin. His knowledge of the nature of Chinese agriculture laid the foundation for a government that relied fundamentally on agriculture. His cross-class alliance in power was based on the farming classes. Most important among those classes in terms of power and influence were the lords and ladies. This feudal elite inside the empire was alarmed at the rise of the newly rich merchant class. The lords worried about threats to their power from enriched merchants. Meanwhile, the Ming rulers expropriated feudal landholdings in the Song and Mongol periods. The government then redivided and sublet the confiscated large estates. After the death of the Yongle Emperor, independent farmer landholders predominated in agriculture. The Song regime featured a strong if complex central government. Emperor Hongwu needed the Grand Secretariat to handle the immense paperwork of the bureaucracy. The Secretariat was responsible for petitions and recommendations to the throne. It prepared the imperial edicts, government ministry reports, and tax records. The Yongle Emperor tried to extend China's influence beyond its borders by demanding other rulers send ambassadors to China and pay tribute. A large navy was built, including 4-masted ships displacing 1,500 tons. A standing army of 2 million troops was built. The Song armies conquered and occupied Vietnam for around 20 years. The Chinese fleet sailed the China Seas and the Indian Ocean, cruising as far as the east coast of Africa. The Chinese gained influence in eastern Wuhulistan. Several maritime Asian nations sent envoys with tribute for the Chinese emperor. And domestically, the Grand Canal was expanded and became a stimulus to domestic trade. Over 100,000 tons of iron per year were produced. Many books were printed using movable type. The Imperial Palace in Beijing's Forbidden City reached its current splendor, and during these centuries, the potential of South China was fully exploited. New crops were widely cultivated, and the porcelain and textile industries flourished. And now we're going to go to our map and take a look at the expeditionary voyages of Muhammad Hezeng. Muhammad Hezeng commanded the great expeditionary voyages of the 1400s. The Chinese flag was planted in the Philippines, Indochina, and the rest of Southeast Asia. His armada sailed to South Asia, Western Asia, and East Africa from 1405 to 1433. Admiral Zheng He's explorations were an existential threat to the feudal ruling classes in China, however, and they finally banned ocean-going voyages in AD 1430. In 1449, Isan Taisi led an Oirat Mongol invasion of northern China that culminated in the capture of the Zhengtong Emperor at Tumu. Afterwards, the Ming regime was on the defensive on the northern frontier. Now the Ming Great Wall was rebuilt for an entirely new reason than the original prevention of farmer flight. Most of what remains of the Great Wall of China was built or repaired by the Ming. The brick and granite work was enlarged, the watchtowers were redesigned, and cannons were placed along its length. And what this means was that the landed ruling class in China was winning out over their bourgeoisie. At sea, the Ming became increasingly isolationist after the death of the Yongle Emperor. The treasure voyages, which had sailed onto the ports of the Indian Ocean, were discontinued. The maritime prohibition laws were set in place banning Chinese from sailing abroad. European traders who reached China in the midst of their age of discovery were repeatedly rebuked in their requests for trade, with the Portuguese being repulsed by the Ming Navy at Tuan-Mun in AD 1521 and again in AD 1522. Domestic and foreign demands for overseas trade were outlawed, and this led to widespread wokou piracy. Wokou means Japanese pirates or dwarf pirates. The term wokou is a combination of wo, W-O, referring either to dwarfs or pejoratively to the Japanese, and ku, K-O-U, bandit. These pirates raided the coastlines of China, Japan, and Korea, and like all pirates, came from an ethnic mixture. These pirates attacked the southeast coastline during the rule of the Jiangjing Emperor from 1507 to 1567. The attacks took time to suppress, and the suppression was never total. Opening the ports in Guangdong and Fujian led to more private and government naval patrols that minimized piracy. According to the history of Ming, 30% of these wokou were Japanese, 70% were Chinese, and many Ming officials were in business with the pirates. China's Great Fleet destroyed. In the AD 1400s, China had owned the greatest seagoing fleet in the world of 3,500 ships. Some Chinese ships were 5 times the size of the ships being built in Europe. Even today, Anglo-American peoples fail to realize how economically and technologically advanced China was in the AD 1400s. China was poised to circumnavigate the globe decades before the Europeans. The treasure fleet was vast in the number and size of its ships, with some vessels 400 feet long. By comparison, Cristobal Colon, that is Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria, was only 60 feet long. Chinese ships typically had several interior decks, 9 masts, and 12 sails. Many had luxurious staterooms and balconies. Their typical cruise size was 1,500. On one journey, 317 of these ships set sail at one time. Under the command of the eunuch admiral Zheng He, the Chinese were routinely sailing to Africa and back decades before Columbus was even born. Yet they did not go on to conquer the world. Instead, the regime decided to destroy the boats and stop sailing west. In the 1470s, the government destroyed Zheng's records so that his expeditions could not be repeated. And by AD 1525, all of China's treasure fleet ships had been burned in their docks by government troops. The Spanish Solution. You will recall from Volume 1 in this series that the Spanish lords and ladies had had to deal with a similar contradiction at home and had opted to keep capitalism outside of their homeland. In a similar resolution, the Portuguese were allowed to settle in Macau in AD 1557 for trade, and Macau was allowed to remain in Portuguese hands until 1999. The Dutch entry into the Chinese seas met with fierce Chinese resistance. The Dutch were chased off the Penghu Islands in the Sino-Dutch War of 1622 to 1624, and the Dutch settled in Taiwan instead. The Dutch in Taiwan fought with the Ming in the Battle of Liaoluo Bay in AD 1633, and they lost. They eventually surrendered to the Ming loyalist Koxinga in 1662 after the fall of the Ming dynasty. In AD 1556, during the rule of the Jiangjing Emperor, the Shanxi earthquake killed about 830,000 people. The Ming dynasty intervened deeply in the Japanese invasions of Korea from AD 1582 through 1598. China forced the withdrawal of all invading Japanese forces in Korea and the restoration of its traditional Joseon ally and tributary kingdom. This regional hegemony of the Ming dynasty was preserved at a high cost. After our next lecture on China, we're going to move to Korea. Now, with Ming's control in Manchuria weakened by the cost of the anti-Japanese war in Korea, the Manchu tribes, under their chieftain Nurhaci, broke away from Ming's rule. A new Chinese imperial regime emerged as a powerful unified state and was later proclaimed as the Qing dynasty, Qing. Those of you familiar with the Indiana Jones series will recall that at the beginning of the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, a movie, the Chinese crime boss was buying the cremated remains of Nurhaci from Dr. Jones. At any rate, the new Qing bosses went on to subdue the much weakened Korea as its tributary, conquered Mongolia, and expanded its territory to the outskirts of the Great Wall. The best Ming army was stationed at Shanhai Pass, guarding this stronghold against the Manchus, and accordingly the central government was too weak to suppress the constant internal peasant uprisings, and the Ming dynasty was overthrown by Li Zicheng's peasant rebellion. Now Li Zicheng was born in Mizi County, Yulin, Shanxi, in the late Ming dynasty. Initially he was a shepherd. He started learning horse riding and archery at the age of 20, and he had worked in a wine shop and as a blacksmith's apprentice. Then a landlord imprisoned him for debt. In AD 1630, Li went on public display in an iron collar and shackles. However, a group of peasants broke him free and proclaimed him as their leader. Initially, they were poorly armed, but they ambushed a group of government soldiers getting real weapons, kind of reminiscent of how Fidel got started after his disastrous landing in Cuba. At any rate, at this time, the Shanxi region was hit by a famine. As usual, usurious land taxes had removed the food base, and the common people rebelled against the Ming government. Li joined the rebel army led by Gao Yingshang, who was nicknamed Dashing King. Li inherited Gao's nickname and command of the rebel army after Gao's death. Within 3 years, Li succeeded in rallying more than 20,000 men to his own rebel army. Li attacked and killed enemy officials in Henan, Shaanxi, and Shanxi provinces. Li advocated the slogan of dividing land equally and abolishing the grain taxes payment system, which won over the farmers. In AD 1642, the landlords created the Kaifeng flood during the Third Battle of Kaifeng by causing breaches of the Yellow River dikes, killing over 300,000 of its 378,000 residents. Then Li captured Changyang and proclaimed himself King Xinsheng. In April of 1644, Li's rebels sacked the Ming capital of Beijing, and the Chongzhen emperor committed suicide. Li proclaimed himself the emperor of the Shun dynasty. And on 27 May 1644, at the Battle of Shanhai Pass, Li's army was defeated by the combined forces of the defecting Ming general Wu Sangyi and the Manchus. In AD 1645, Li fled from Beijing towards his base in Shanxi and disappeared. He may have been killed in the Battle of Mount Jiangong, but that has not yet been proven. And that takes us to the final Chinese feudal dynasty, the Qing dynasty, from AD 1644 to 1911. The Qing dynasty was the last imperial dynasty in China. It was founded by the Manchus. It was the second conquest dynasty to rule all of China. The Manchus were formerly known as Jurchens. They lived in the northeastern part of the Ming territory outside the Great Wall. They emerged as the major threat to the late Ming dynasty after Nurhaci united all Jurchen tribes and established an independent kingdom. The Manchus allied with the former Ming general Wu Sangyi to seize Beijing, which was made the capital of the Qing dynasty. Then they subdued the Ming remnants in the south. In AD 1662, Tungning was founded by the Ming loyalist Koxinga after the fall of the southern Ming. It served as the base for continuing Ming resistance in southern China. Decades of Manchu rule caused enormous loss of lives, and accordingly the economic scale of China shrank drastically. The Qing conquest of the Ming from AD 1618 to 1683 cost as many as 25 million lives. The Manchus absorbed the imperial government. The Manchus enforced a queue order, where Han Chinese were forced to adopt the Manchu queue hairstyle. Officials were required to wear Manchu-style clothing, Changshan bannerman dress, and Tang Zhuang. Ordinary Han civilians were allowed to wear traditional Han clothing or Han Fu, and most Han then voluntarily shifted to wearing Qipao. The Fourth Qing Empire was Kangxi. He was the first to be born south of Shanhai Pass near Beijing, and he was the second Qing emperor to rule over all of China. His reign of 61 years makes him the longest reigning emperor in Chinese history.
although his grandson had the longest period of de facto power and was also one of the longest reigning rulers in the world. However, since the boy ascended the throne at the age of 7, actual power had been held for 6 years by 4 regents and his grandmother, the Grand Empress Dowager Xiaozhang. Kangxi suppressed the revolt of the 3 feudatories, forced the kingdom of Tongning to Taiwan, and brought Mongol rebels in the north and northwest to submission. He blocked Tsarist Russia on the Amur River, retaining outer Manchuria and northwest China. All in all, the Kangxi Emperor's reign brought about long-term stability and relative wealth after years of war and chaos in the period known as the prosperous era of Kangxi and Qianlong, or Hai Qing. The Kangxi Emperor ordered the creation of the Kangxi Dictionary. This was the most complete dictionary of Chinese characters yet compiled. The Qing dynasty set up the 8-banner system that was the framework for the Qing military organization. Bannermen were designated as a form of nobility and given preferential treatment in annual pensions, land, and allotments of cloth. Bannermen could not undertake trade or manual labor. To do so, they would have to petition for removal from banner status. As I say, from AD 1673 to 1681, the Kangxi Emperor suppressed the revolt of the 3 feudatories. This was an uprising of 3 generals in southern China who had been denied hereditary rule of large fiefdoms granted by the previous emperor. In AD 1683, the Qing staged an amphibious assault on southern Taiwan. This brought down the rebel kingdom of Tongning. The Qing defeated the Russians at Albazin, resulting in the Treaty of Nerchinsk. Over a half-century, all areas previously under the Ming dynasty were consolidated under the Qing. Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia were also formally incorporated into Chinese territory. By the end of Qianlong Emperor's long reign, the Qing Empire was at its zenith. China ruled more than 1/3 of the world's population and had the largest economy in the world. By area, it was one of the largest empires ever. Now, the downfall of the Qing begins with imperialist invasion. In the AD 1800s, the empire was internally stagnant and externally threatened by Western powers. The British privateers led the way by using opium from their estates in India at essentially no cost and smuggling the drug into Canton. There they dumped it at rock-bottom prices to the masses that had never enjoyed even a moment of pleasure in their entire lives. In short, the Brit opium traders made a market where none had existed. This drug market paid in silver coin. Thus the Brit opium traders had cash flowing into their hands rather than silver from Britain flowing outward to China. Presumably, they took care of themselves, and the drug kings certainly had the cash to bribe Parliament back home and to suborn Chinese officials, subverting the Qing regime. Now we come to the Opium Wars. In AD 1840, China was defeated by Britain in the First Opium War. This led to the first of the unequal treaties, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, and importation of opium produced in British India was allowed. Military defeats and unequal treaties with other Western powers continued. In the 1850 to 1864 Taiping Rebellion was nominally a quasi-Christian religious movement. At its head was the heavenly king Hong Xiuquan. The belligerents were the Manchu Qing dynasty against the movement of the Heavenly Kingdom of Peace. The Taiping Rebellion began in the southern province of Guangxi when local officials launched a campaign of persecution against the God-worshipping society and its leader, Hong Xiuquan. Hong declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hong raided a third of Chinese territory for over a decade. His armies were finally crushed in the Third Battle of Nanking in 1864. This was one of the largest wars in the 1800s in terms of troop involvement. China suffered a massive death toll of 200 million, with millions more displaced. The role of the Taipings had been the wholesale transformation and reformation of China. Rather than simply supplementing the ruling class, the Taiping sought to liquidate ruling classes forever. Fighting went on for 14 years in the provinces of Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Anhui, Jiangxi, Hubei, and Gansu. Hong's final defeat did not end civil disturbances. The banner system that the Manchus had relied upon for so long failed. The Qing regime was unable to suppress constant farmer rebellion. The government called upon local officials in the provinces to raise new armies. They did so, and for the moment they crushed the challenges to Qing authority. However, China never rebuilt a strong central army, and in its place many local officials became warlords. The Qing Empire was dying from internal bourgeois growth and foreign capitalist imperialism that sought to colonize China as it had the rest of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. From 1864 to 1910, in response to calamities within the empire and threats from imperialism, the self-strengthening movement was an institutional reform in the second half of the 1800s. The aim was to modernize the empire with prime emphasis on strengthening the military. However, corrupt officials, cynicism, and quarrels within the imperial family undermined the reform. Consequently, the Beiyang fleet was soundly defeated in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. The Wangshu Emperor and the Reformists then launched a more comprehensive reform effort, the 100 Days Reform of 1898, but it was soon overturned by the conservatives under Empress Dowager Shi in a military coup. At the turn of the 20th century, the violent Boxer Rebellion opposed foreign influence in northern China and attacked Chinese Christians and missionaries. When Boxers entered Beijing, the Qing government ordered all foreigners to leave. Instead, the foreigners and many Chinese were besieged in the Foreign Legations Quarter of Beijing. The Eight-Nation Alliance sent the Seymour Expedition of Japanese, Russian, Italian, German, Austrian, French, and U.S. troops and relieved the siege. The expedition was stopped by the Boxers at the Battle of Langfang and forced to retreat. Due to the Alliance's attack on the Daegu forts, the Qing government in response sided with the Boxers and declared war on the Alliance. There was fierce fighting at Tientsin. The Alliance formed the second, much larger Gasoli expedition and finally reached Beijing. The Qing government evacuated to Xi'an. The Boxer Protocol ended the war. And that brought us to the 1911 Chinese Revolution. The 1911 Chinese Revolution overthrew China's Qing imperial dynasty. From it emerged the Republic of China. Revolutionary struggles, revolts, and uprisings culminated in the turning point of the Wuchang Uprising on October 10, 1911. What had begun in a labor dispute with the Railway Protection Movement ended with the abdication of the 6-year-old last emperor, Pu Yi, on February 12, 1912. 2,000 years of imperial feudalism thus ended. And this lecture will end now too. We have one more to do on China, which of course has to do with the formation of the Communist Party in 1921. I want to just point out real quickly on this map how Admiral Zhang He's fleets moved, to give you an example of what a vast region. They had gone all the way to Africa, they had gone all the way up here to Europe, actually, and all the way down here, all the way into the Philippines. They were set to circumnavigate the globe, but their internal class contradictions prevented that. And so it was decided that China would not pursue these kind of objectives anymore. And the real reason for that was that these traders were accumulating so much cash that they could buy and sell these landlords, and they had destroyed the entire feudal system on the land. And so in this case, the bourgeoisie lost out for the time being. And whereas in Europe, the bourgeoisie eventually defeated the feudalists. And that is the end of Lecture 55F.